I'm Dr. Johan Nilsson, and this is Political Perennialism. I make these videos with a singular purpose, that is, to get my viewers to give up their addiction to the opium of politics, and turn their minds instead toward the one great matter of the afterlife. I have to assume that most of my viewers are, unfortunately, engaged in politics. What is more, it is likely you have some affiliation, or at least sympathy, with one or another of the sides in the political divide. I say one or another because I suspect most of my audience is American. Although, truth be told, even if I am wrong, America's today tends to become the rest of the world's tomorrow. What I hope to do with this short video is to demonstrate to you why your engagement with politics is likely distorting your perception of reality. In the course of doing so, I will make some original arguments about the dynamics of polarization. While I am concerned about polarization, there is no need to roll your eyes in disgust. This is not a call for enlightened centrism. As I will argue in a forthcoming book, polarization is dangerous as it destabilizes the liberal democratic system. I am very far from an adherent of liberal democracy. Quite the opposite. But I fear its destabilization because the downward arc of history makes it unlikely that the coming undone of the liberal democratic order heralds the restoration of one I would approve of. That is to say, one grounded in metaphysical truth. Rather, liberal democracy, should it come to an end, is likely to be replaced by something more frightful. I have no delusions about the scope of my influence. The possibility that my work will have any meaningful effect in preserving liberal democracy is terribly remote. My intention with this video, as I've already stated, is purely to inch my viewers towards a disillusionment with politics. Devil shift is a concept first conceived of by Paul Sabatier together with Susan Hunter and Susan McLaughlin. It refers to the tendency of actors in competition with other actors in some area of policy to not evaluate their competitors in a rational manner, but rather to project onto them two fallacies. Firstly, to regard their competitors as more morally corrupt than they actually are, and secondly, to regard them as more powerful than they actually are. To Sabatier's theory, I would add a third fallacy, the tendency to see their competitors as more irrational than they really are. Devil shift is, in my estimation, a very real phenomenon. To illustrate, let us take a suitably controversial example, that of Donald Trump. Trump is regularly characterized as a racist and as a fascist. This, I submit, is an excellent example of devil shift in operation. This is no defense of Trump. The man is deeply distasteful, lacking in virtue or competence for his office, and dangerous both in the ideas he emboldens domestically, and even more so in the recklessness and fecklessness of his foreign policy. However, this does not prevent him from being the subject of devil shift. Let us consider his attitudes towards immigration. Imagine a continuum of anti-immigration policy orientations. This spectrum runs from the most moderate anti-immigration positions to the most radical. Where do you place Trump? At the most radical end, we have the most brutish National Socialists, represented by organizations like Combat 18, who would advocate the mass killing of non-white immigrants and their descendants. Somewhat more moderate are groups like Patriot Front or the British National Party, who propose repatriation, i.e. kicking non-white immigrants and their descendants out of the country. Where does a man go who, for example, was born in this country to a Nigerian father and a Korean mother? That is none of their concern. A further step along the spectrum in the direction of moderation, we find those who, instead of repatriation, prefer remigration. Remigration conceives of itself as more humane than repatriation, and by all accounts is. It entails the use of incentives to encourage recent immigrants and their descendants to return to their country of origin. It is usually accompanied by a blanket ban on immigration, or at least an insistence on net zero migration. The next most moderate position on the spectrum is exactly this: net zero migration, or a blanket ban on immigration, but without remigration. Thereafter come policies to reduce, but not end, immigration, followed finally by an opposition only to irregular or undocumented immigration. Where on this spectrum do we place Trump? Speaking objectively, it must be somewhere between the final and penultimate positions. Again, one may be entirely justified in opposing Trump's positions on immigration. His temporary ban on immigration from some Muslim countries, while not unprecedented, was certainly framed in indisputably Islamophobic terms. His border wall was arguably ineffective and advocated for in intentionally crude language. The point, however, is that the emotional image of Trump vis-à-vis immigrants is as something much more demonic than he actually is. He is also likely seen as more powerful than he actually is. For all the panic about Trump upon his election in 2016, he effected remarkably little of what he promised on the campaign trail regarding immigration. This was not out of goodwill, but rather out of powerlessness. His wall was not built, and his executive order intended to limit Muslim immigration was quickly struck down. So, we see that Trump is not as powerful as his opponents imagine either. If my viewer is sympathetic to Trump, the proceeding likely elicited smug agreement. My Trump-leaning viewer should, however, not imagine that he or she is not also subject to devil shift. To illustrate the point with an anecdote, I once met a Trump voter prior to the 2020 election. This was at the stage in the primaries where there were about 20 candidates running for the Democrat presidential nomination. This Trumpian insisted that every single one of these 20 was a Marxist. Now, in fact, none of these were Marxists. Joe Biden is not a Marxist. Even Bernie Sanders is not a Marxist. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that, at least in 2020, there was not a single Marxist in any elite position in the Democrat Party. Was my Trumpian acquaintances' misidentification down to poor understanding of political terminology? Most likely. The same could also be said for the frequent identification or misidentification of Trump as a fascist and or racist. But his claim had more to it than just mere ignorance. Devil shift was also at play. He felt that there was something distinctly diabolical about the Democrat presidential offerings. His use of the term Marxist was at some level an emotive expression. His use of the label Marxist was on some level an expression of his emotive view of Democrats. What my acquaintance saw in these Democrats, and what you may well see in your opponents, is not the actual figure before you, but the monstrous shadow that they cast on the wall behind them. This shadow resembles your opponent in general outline, but is deformed, tenebrous, and gargantuan. This is what being afflicted with devil shift is like. If you are forced to reflect, you may come to the realization that your opponent is not quite the demon that you have depicted them as. Consider this. As bad as they are, who is worse? Was Joe Stalin worse than Joe Biden? How is the Georgian different from the senile American? The Republicans may be awful bigots, but can you honestly say that you would be indifferent if they were replaced in their positions of power by, say, the Aryan nations? Surely the Aryan nations is worse. If you think I'm wrong in what I'm insinuating, why have you not picked up arms against these villains? Why is respecting the liberal democratic process so important if the winning side is as tyrannical as you claim? My hope here is, of course, that you do see that the Democrats and the Republicans, or whatever the analogues are wherever you live, are not nearly as demonic as you imagine them to be. Of course, there is a risk that you will, wrongly, come to the conclusion that that shadow upon the wall is in fact real, and respond to my challenge by reaching for a gun. Take a deep breath. The other side is not nearly as wicked as you believe. We are instructed to love our neighbours, not to shoot them. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack. Link also in the description.